Hello everybody and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Video Clips, and as usual I'll start with some announcements. First of all, my colleague and friend Dr. Kelly Turner, who wrote the amazing book Radical Remission, now has an online course that discusses the 9 strategies that cancer patients, terminal cancer patients, use to stay alive and survive. And I really am fond of this book. I probably have recommended it to a few hundred people since I read it over a year ago. I did an advanced study course on it. And as I have mentioned so many times, the book is certainly invaluable for cancer patients, but I think there is a lot that can be learned by those of us who don't want to get cancer about the important things that we should be paying attention to in our lives every day. So I'm taking this course, and if you would like to take it, I can give you a discount code that will allow you to save $50 until April 1st. So you have to email me at pampopper@msn.com, and then I'm happy to provide you with that discount code. And then the second thing is I am really excited about this month's advanced study course. I'm excited about all of them, but I'm doing the classes on a book called The Mind and the Brain, which is written by a psychiatrist/neuroscientist who has documented that obsessive-compulsive patients can learn to think differently and reduce or eliminate their obsessive-compulsive symptoms, and then brain imaging shows that in the process of doing this that they rewire their brain and are no longer obsessive-compulsive. So anyway, exciting stuff when you give people information that helps them to recover and gain control of their health instead of feeling like helpless victims who don't understand what's going on with them. And then last but not least, we are officially taking enrollments for the Diet and Lifestyle Summer Course, which always features the celebrity lineup, instructors such as Caldwell Esselstyn and Neil Barnard and Alan Goldhammer from True North, Dr. Mark Schultz, the author of Invasion of the Prostate Snatchers, Dr. Ralph Moss, CancerDecisions.com, the list goes on and on. It's really impressive, and it is the best way, if you're a healthcare professional looking for new strategies to help your patients, this is the way to learn. All right, so let's get into today's topic. A lot of health professionals and health agencies have been advocating for huge reform in the way that clinical trials are conducted and the way that the results are reported. One of the most outspoken critics is Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and author of the book The Truth About Drug Companies. In an article in which she reports some of the misbehavior of drug companies with reference to studies and clinical trials, she says, quote, and I think this is, it's almost a devastating quote to hear, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." She cites several examples of some of the conflicts of interest that make study conclusions questionable, including Dr. Alan Schatzberg, chair of Stanford's psychiatry department, who owned over $6 million worth of stock in a drug maker, while he was the principal investigator for a National Institutes of Health funded study of one of the drugs made by the company he owned stock in. He also co-authored 3 papers about the drug. Now, Stanford initially said in a public statement that they didn't see anything wrong with this, but they did replace him as lead investigator. Another example is this Dr. Charles Nemeroff at Emory University, who was the lead investigator in another National Institutes of Health funded study of several drugs made by Glaxo. Nemeroff was paid over $500,000 to speak for Glaxo, which he failed to disclose as required by the university's rules and regulations. Now, these are egregious examples, but the fact is that the vast majority of doctors have some type of financial relationship with drug companies, which can include things like gifts and meals and serving as paid consultants, speaking at conferences, and ghost authoring papers. Additionally, the drug companies sponsor most of the meetings of professional organizations and provide most of the continuing education programs that are required for the renewal of medical licenses. Perhaps the worst consequence of drug company influence is the part that affects the conducting of clinical trials, which are required in order to gain FDA approval for drugs and devices and tests. The results of all trials are supposed to be submitted to the FDA, and if only 1 or 2 show safety and efficacy, then that's a pretty loose definition, as I've come to realize, then the drug is approved, usually for treating a specific condition. After approval, drug companies conduct additional trials, usually because they're trying to get the drug approved to treat other conditions and broaden the sale of their product. Medical schools are a favorite site for drug trials since influential faculty members are often involved. Marcia Angel says that studies show that 3/5 of medical school department chairs receive personal income from drug companies. This gives the drug companies a lot of control over how the studies are designed, and then what's even worse is often data from a study is submitted to, the raw data is submitted to a drug company, and then the drug company uses its own staff to prepare information for submission to medical journals and to the FDA. So not surprisingly, most industry-sponsored research shows that drugs are safe and effective. To give the illusion that a considerable body of research documents the safety and efficacy of a drug, the people at the drug company who write all this stuff up submit the results to several different journals in several different forms. Negative results are often not published. Angel reports that a review of 74 clinical trials shows that 37 out of 38 positive trials were studied. But for studies that were negative, out of 36 of them, 33 were either not published or spun to make it look like the results were positive. So you might wonder, how do you take a study that shows a negative result and spin it so that the results look positive? Well, this is usually done by ignoring the failure of the drug to treat a particular condition and instead noting its efficacy for a secondary and unexpected benefit. One research group used the Freedom of Information Act to access FDA reviews for the 6 most widely prescribed psychiatric drugs, or antidepressants. They reported that placebos were 80% as effective as the drugs, and the difference between placebo and the drugs was so tiny as to be almost statistically insignificant. The drugs were billion-dollar sellers only because the positive results were spun and the negative results withheld. So this fraudulent activity has resulted in major changes in how physicians are educated in medical school and how they practice. They're trained to use lots of drugs to treat symptoms, even when diet and lifestyle changes or doing nothing at all would actually make a whole lot better sense. Patients are trained through advertising to think that there are drugs for everything and they should go ask their doctors for the drugs. So, and some of the stuff isn't even pathology. I mean, shy around new people, there's a drug for that. Constipated, no reason to go purchase an over-the-counter laxative or eat more fiber. There are drugs for that too. There's a drug for everything. The drug companies, no question, are guilty of some egregious behavior, but the real issue is that they would not be able to get away with this if it were not for the involvement and compliance of physicians and medical schools and academics and government and the disease groups, all of whom do their little part to create this awful, messy situation that I'm describing to you. Now let's get to the part where there's some good news. I don't like to just give you bad news all the time. So we need a lot of reform, but one change that seems to be making a bit of a difference, and I think it's something we can build on, is the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997, which established the requirement that many clinical trials have to be registered at trial initiation, and trial results have to be reported on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. The law was passed to address some of the misbehavior that I've been describing here, and the registration process began in the year 2000. Registration is actually required for drugs and tests and that sort of thing that deal with serious or life-threatening conditions, and companies have to provide upfront information about the study's purpose, recruitment status, design, eligibility criteria, locations, and then pre-specified primary and secondary outcomes. This last part really addresses the issue of drug companies having a complete failure for what they're testing the drug for and finding some unknown secondary benefit. They have to state up front what the objectives are. So based on this, recently researchers looked at what kind of effect this has had. So how they did it is they took all of the large National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute funded randomized control trials between 1970 and 2012 that evaluated the use of drugs or supplements for treating cardiovascular disease. 55 trials were reviewed, and they were categorized based on several criteria, which included when they were published, before or after that 2000 date when the registration process began, whether or not they were registered prior to publication, whether or not they used active or placebo comparator, and industry sponsorship. The researchers noted that if the study reported a positive, negative, or null result on the primary outcome measured in total mortality. Well, here was the results, and I don't think this is very shocking here. 17 out of 30 studies published before 2000 showed a significant benefit, 57%, on the primary outcome. But for the ones published after 2000, only 2 out of the 26, 8%. So we went from 57% down to 8%. The researchers reported that pre-registration in clinicaltrial.gov was strongly associated with null findings. Even better, since this all happened, as medical journals have begun requiring registration in order to consider accepting a study for publication. In 2004, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors started requiring registration for publication in major medical journals. Well, the researchers concluded that null findings are most likely disappointing to drug companies and researchers, but they are most certainly better for public health. They report that a recent analysis showed that publication of the Women's Health Initiative clinical trial could have resulted in 126,000 fewer deaths from breast cancer and 76,000 fewer deaths from heart disease just between 2003 and 2012. That is a huge difference. Well, the battle is far from over. I mean, corruption and conflict of interest are still the norm and pervasive in the healthcare field and with drug companies. But more disclosure in clinical trials is a very good first step, and paying attention to this issue and showing what happens when you shine the light of public attention on drug companies' behavior, I think can eventually increase the demand for transparency, and we'll see more of this type of thing happening. Along that line, and I wrote an article about it and did a video clip on it not too long ago, is at some point in time, and I can't remember right offhand exactly when this happened, the government started requiring drug companies to post online the doctors and how much money they get paid by the drug company for speaking and all kinds of things, and it caused quite a stir. I know that some of the doctors here in Columbus, where I live, when the newspaper did an article on the issue, were kind of hostile to the idea. They didn't like it. Of course they didn't like it. If you got $500,000 last year from a drug company, you might not be too geeked up about your patients knowing about that, but that has made a difference. Definitely I've seen some squeamishness on behalf of some doctors about their relationships with drug companies. So I'm all for making everybody feel more squeamish and nervous and that sort of thing, if that's what it takes to get all this out in the open so that people can make better choices and so that the drug companies and the medical associations don't get their way on everything. All right, that's all for today as usual. Pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you on Thursday with more news.